Every day you wake up and voluntarily do a series of things that are measurably shrinking your brain. Literally, physically shrinking it. In a way that shows up on scans. I want you to hold on to that image. This is closer to an autopsy than a self-help video. We're going to walk through the habits, the foods, the daily routines that neuroscience has actually quantified as making you cognitively worse. The uncomfortable part is this. The people most likely to dismiss what I'm about to say are usually the ones neck deep in it. I keep coming back to the same idea. A lot of this damage is voluntary. By the end, you'll understand why it fits. So let's start with the thing you're probably doing right now. Your phone, it's near you right now. Maybe in your hand, maybe face down on a desk, screen occasionally lighting up like a little heartbeat demanding attention. Gloria Mark, a researcher at UC Irvine, measured something that should genuinely worry you. Every time you glance at your phone, even for 5 seconds, it takes your brain an average of 23 minutes to fully return to whatever you were doing before. 23 minutes of cognitive recovery for a 5-second glance. The time cost alone is brutal. Each interruption also triggers a simultaneous spike in cortisol and dopamine. Stress and reward firing together. Your brain is being punished and bribed at the same time, which, if you know anything about conditioning, is exactly how you build an addiction loop. The phone buzzes. You feel a tiny jolt of anxiety. You check it, and you feel a tiny hit of relief. That sequence gets filed away as something worth repeating, and your brain obliges, over and over. The permanence is the worst part. Heavy phone checkers show reduced working memory as a baseline trait, measured even when there's no phone in the room. The pattern has already been installed. Think of it like a tax. Every interruption you indulge has a cost, and that cost compounds across the day, across the week, across the year. You're paying interest on distraction. The phone is also replacing something your brain desperately needs, and we've been giving it away for free. In 2011, a psychologist named Betsy Sparrow at Columbia ran a study that should have gotten more attention than it did. Her participants read facts on a screen, and half were told the information would be saved for them to access later. That group remembered significantly less, even while actively reading it. Your brain, it turns out, is constantly running a background calculation. Do I need to store this, or can I find it again? The moment it decides you have a reliable external source, your phone, Google, whatever, it quietly deprioritizes the information. If your brain trusts that the information will still be there later, it becomes less likely to keep it. Memory is the substrate of creative thought. When you solve a problem, when you make an unexpected connection, when you have an idea that feels genuinely original, you're drawing on a web of things you've retained, often without realizing it. You can't make use of information you never held on to. The same thing applies to GPS. People who rely on navigation apps show measurably reduced spatial reasoning compared to people who navigate by memory. I noticed this in myself last month. Tried to give someone directions to a restaurant I've driven to probably 50 times and completely blanked on the street names. The brain regions responsible for mental mapping, the same regions London taxi drivers famously developed through years of memorizing routes, are quietly shrinking in the rest of us. You're getting more dependent and calling it efficiency. All of which connects to the closest thing science has to a villain in this story. You already know who it is. Sleep. Specifically, the lack of it. Matthew Walker, the neuroscientist who's spent decades studying what happens to the brain during sleep, quantified something that sounds almost too dramatic to be real. After 17 to 19 hours of being awake, which is a normal day for most people who wake up early and stay up a bit late, your cognitive impairment is equivalent to a blood alcohol content of 0.05%, legally impaired in most countries. One bad night. What happens underneath is even more alarming. While you sleep, your brain activates something called the glymphatic system, basically your brain's cleaning cycle. Cerebrospinal fluid floods through your neural tissue and flushes out metabolic waste, including a protein called amyloid beta. That name might sound familiar. Amyloid beta is one of the primary proteins associated with Alzheimer's disease. Skip sleep, and the waste accumulates. Night after night after night. Skip enough sleep, and that waste starts piling up, which is not great. Then there's the structural damage. The hippocampus, that memory center we mentioned, shrinks under chronic sleep restriction, measurably, visibly on scans. A structural change to the organ you think with. Worth a moment of concern, yeah? Sleep-deprived people consistently overestimate their own performance. They think they've adapted. They've lost the ability to perceive how impaired they are. The instrument they'd use to measure the damage is the very thing that's been damaged. The primary weapon here, the chemical doing much of the structural harm, is cortisol. And there's another major source of it, one you're generating yourself. Cortisol is useful in short bursts. Tiger jumps out of a bush, cortisol spikes, you run, you survive, cortisol drops. For real danger, it's a brilliant system. As a daily baseline, though, it's catastrophic. When cortisol stays elevated through chronic work stress, financial anxiety, relationship tension, just the ambient noise of modern life, it starts physically remodeling your brain. The prefrontal cortex, which handles planning and impulse control, shrinks. The hippocampus, which handles memory formation, shrinks too. Once again, memory is one of the first things taking the hit. And then there's rumination, the thing where you replay a conversation from 3 years ago at 2 in the morning, or mentally rehearse a conflict that hasn't happened yet. You know the feeling. Lying in bed, suddenly arguing with someone who isn't there. Your brain cannot tell the difference between a real threat and a thought you keep replaying. The tiger and the typo in a work email you sent last Tuesday produce the same chemical response. Recent research has linked chronic rumination to elevated tau protein levels. Tau is, alongside amyloid beta, one of the key biomarkers of Alzheimer's. The more often your brain stays locked in threat mode, the more damage that stress can do over time. That's a measurable biological pathway, documented and repeatable. Every replayed argument, every imagined catastrophe, every night you lie awake running worst-case scenarios, you are soaking your brain in a chemical that is actively dissolving its structure. Join our YouTube membership for exclusive perks like early access to scripts, input on future topics about productivity, and connect with a like-minded community that gets it. Click join below and let's build your easier, more intentional life together. Your brain also can't distinguish between learning about something and actually doing it. An entire industry has been built on that confusion. Productivity content, self-improvement videos, podcasts about optimization, books about thinking better. I've consumed more of these than I'm comfortable admitting, which is partly how I know what happens next. Your brain gets a dopamine hit from the idea of improvement. The planning, the imagining, the feeling of, I'm going to change. All of it triggers the same reward pathways that would fire if you actually changed. The reward arrives before the work. Predictably, the work rarely follows, because why would it? You already feel like you've accomplished something. Psychologists call a version of this the licensing effect. When you feel virtuous, when you've done something that signals progress, you become less likely to follow through with the hard part. Buying a gym membership feels like exercise. Watching a video about focus feels like focusing. Reading about habits feels like building one. All rehearsal, no show. The irony of making a video about this is fully visible to me. There's also something called the Zeigarnik effect, working against you here. Your brain keeps unfinished tasks in working memory, creating a kind of productive tension, but consuming content about productivity tricks the brain into feeling like the task has been addressed. Your brain gets a sense of closure without you actually doing anything. People who consume the most self-improvement content often accomplish the least. That pattern shows up reliably in the research, and I suspect a few people watching right now just felt a twinge of recognition. The content starts to replace the effort it's supposed to inspire, which brings us to attention span, something you're actively dismantling through another habit entirely. 15 seconds. That's the unit of content now. Someone pointing at floating text while a sped-up voice explains why Cleopatra was closer in time to the iPhone than to the pyramids. Then another clip, then another, then another. Each of those 15-second clips delivers a tiny dopamine spike because your brain loves novelty. For most of human history, new things were either food or danger, and both required immediate attention. The response is hardwired. Fair enough. But a diet of constant novelty recalibrates your dopamine threshold. Your brain adjusts upward, starts requiring more stimulation to feel the same level of engagement. Sustained attention, reading a book, following a long argument, sitting with a complex problem starts to feel physically uncomfortable. I mean that precisely. Uncomfortable. Your neurochemistry has been retrained to expect a new stimulus every 15 seconds, and anything that withholds one feels like deprivation. I'm not entirely sure why this specific threshold became the industry standard, but every platform converged on it independently. That tells you something. Neuroplasticity doesn't care what you practice. Practice sustained focus, and your brain gets better at sustained focus. Practice consuming novelty every 15 seconds, and your brain gets better at that instead. You're training distraction, and you're doing it for hours a day. Your dopamine threshold has recalibrated until anything complex feels unbearable. You are, right now, watching a 20-minute video about how short videos damage cognition. Meanwhile, your multitasking habit is finishing the job. So let's talk about that. Multitasking isn't really what's happening. Clifford Nass at Stanford set out to find what heavy multitaskers were actually good at. He expected reasonably that people who constantly juggle multiple tasks would have developed some cognitive advantage. Better working memory, maybe, or faster task switching. He found the opposite. Heavy multitaskers were worse at filtering irrelevant information, worse at switching between tasks, worse at working memory, worse at literally everything the researchers tested. That's science for you sometimes. What you call multitasking is actually rapid task switching, and every switch has a cost, a small cognitive toll, individually negligible. It accumulates across the day until, by 5 o'clock, you're running on fumes and resentment, wondering why you feel exhausted despite having accomplished almost nothing. One thing poorly, then another thing poorly, then the first thing poorly again. Your working memory quietly bleeds through all of it. The finding that really stings, the one Nass kept coming back to in interviews, the people most confident in their multitasking ability were the worst performers, every time, without exception. Everything so far has been about what you're doing with your time and attention. Now, let's talk about what you're putting in your body. Sugar. Specifically, the amount of it you're drinking. Studies on sugary beverages have shown measurable shrinkage of the hippocampus. There's that poor hippocampus again, within a time frame that should alarm you. We're talking weeks. Your brain produces a protein called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is basically fertilizer for your neurons. It grows new synaptic connections, strengthens existing ones, supports the kind of neuroplasticity that lets you learn and adapt. Sugar suppresses it. A high-sugar diet triggers insulin spikes, which trigger neuroinflammation, which suppresses BDNF production, which impairs synaptic plasticity. Your brain is trying to adapt and grow, and a high-sugar diet works against that. High-fructose corn syrup is particularly efficient at this, impairing synaptic plasticity through a slightly different pathway that converges on the same result. Fewer connections, weaker signaling, measurably slower cognition. Ultra-processed foods amplify the damage further. Research has linked high consumption of ultra-processed food to shrinkage in brain regions specifically associated with learning and memory. The food is working against the organ you're trying to feed, and while we're in the territory of things you'd rather not hear, your dentist is, unfortunately, correct. Poor oral health creates a direct pathway for bacteria to reach the brain, and the resulting chronic inflammation has been linked to significantly increased dementia risk. Floss. I know, I'm sorry. Floss anyway. Your diet is affecting your cognition on a timeline of weeks, and your commute might be compounding the damage. Sitting. Endless, motionless sitting. A study out of UCLA found that people who sit for 6 or more hours a day show measurable thinning of the medial temporal lobe, the brain region that forms memories. Thin that out, and new memories become harder to create. You're encoding less. There's a difference between forgetting more and encoding less, and most people never make it. Remember BDNF, the brain fertilizer that sugar suppresses? Your body primarily produces it through physical movement. Exercise grows your brain. That's literal, measurable, demonstrated. The inverse is also true. Sit still long enough. BDNF production drops, growth slows, and the regions that depend on it start to thin. Now, long commutes. If you're driving 2+ hours a day, you're absorbing a triple hit that most people never think about. First, chronic stress from traffic. Cortisol, which we've covered. Second, prolonged sitting, which suppresses BDNF. Third, the earlier wake time and later return that compresses your sleep window. Chronic stress plus sedentary BDNF suppression plus reduced sleep. It's a perfect combination of voluntary brain damage disguised as a normal commute. Movement matters. So does what you're moving through. Specifically, what you're listening to while you do it. Your headphones are too loud. You know this. Research from Johns Hopkins established that hearing loss forces your brain to recruit processing resources from memory and executive function regions just to decode degraded sound. Every conversation, every lecture, every podcast. Your brain working overtime to fill in gaps. There's a concept called cognitive load theory that explains why. Your brain has a finite processing budget, and when more of that budget gets diverted to the basic task of hearing, less remains for comprehension, memory formation, and higher order thinking. Like trying to read a book while someone keeps tapping your shoulder. Then the secondary cascade begins. As hearing deteriorates, people withdraw from social situations. Conversations become exhausting, social engagement drops, and social isolation independently accelerates cognitive decline. A lot of the damage builds gradually through habits that feel harmless when you're young. So far, we've covered what you're doing, what you're eating, how you're moving, and what you're listening to. Now let's talk about how you're thinking, specifically how you're thinking about yourself. Believing you're already smart is one of the most reliable predictors of getting dumber. Carol Dweck's research on mindset showed something that sounds simple but has real structural consequences. People who believe intelligence is fixed, you're either smart or you're not, consistently avoid challenges, give up earlier, and learn less over time. People who believe intelligence is malleable do the opposite. The belief itself shapes the behavior, which shapes the brain. Your theory about your own intelligence becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The finding everyone cites, but almost nobody applies to themselves. Low-competence individuals don't just overestimate their ability. They lack the metacognitive architecture required to perceive their own errors. They're incapable of doubt, and that's different from choosing confidence. Over time, overconfident people reject expertise, stop seeking new information, dismiss correction as bias. Confidence hardens into a barrier against new information, a shell that gets thicker every year, while the mind inside it quietly stagnates. That reply reflex, by the way, the compulsion to always have an answer, to respond immediately, to never sit with uncertainty. Research on executive function suggests it's actually a sign of weak impulse control. The smarter response, neurologically speaking, is the pause, the consideration, the willingness to say, I don't know, which connects directly to the last habit worth discussing, and probably the most insidious, because it feels the most harmless. Doom-scrolling news consumption, the ambient background noise of threat that you've piped directly into your brain every waking hour. Your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, did not evolve for a world where you can learn about every disaster, every political mess, every injustice on earth, continuously in your pocket, while eating cereal. It evolved for a world where threats were local, physical, and rare. Now you're flooding it with global, abstract, and constant stimulation. The result is hyperactivation. Your amygdala fires more often, more intensely, and with less discrimination. You become more reactive and less rational, because the prefrontal cortex, the part that evaluates and overrides impulse, gets progressively sidelined. Your brain evolved a negativity bias for survival. Algorithms exploit it for engagement. They have learned, through billions of data points, that threat-based content keeps you scrolling. They are cultivating your fear response for profit. Then there's the illusory truth effect. See a false claim once, you dismiss it. See it 5 times, it feels plausible. See it 20 times, it feels like something everyone knows. Your brain tracks familiarity, and it confuses familiarity with truth. Repeated exposure to misinformation increases its perceived credibility, regardless of whether you consciously know it's false. Your rational mind can reject a claim, while your pattern recognition system quietly absorbs it anyway. The content actively displaces your ability to think clearly. So, you've been farming your amygdala, draining your attention, outsourcing your memory, skipping sleep, living under constant stress, eating sugar, sitting still, blasting your eardrums, congratulating yourself on how smart you are, and mistaking the feeling of being informed for the reality of being competent. So, what does all of that add up to? None of these are isolated. They cluster. This is why people get stuck in loops. One bad habit makes the next one more likely. Doomscrolling cuts into sleep. Bad sleep makes you crave quick energy. Quick energy usually means sugar. Low energy makes movement less likely. Less movement makes focus worse. Now, the honest caveat: you're not entirely to blame. Algorithms are designed to exploit your neurochemistry. Food systems are built around sugar and convenience. Work culture rewards busyness over depth. The structural forces are real, and pretending this is purely a matter of willpower would be wrong. You're also not entirely off the hook. Every one of these behaviors has a choice point somewhere in the chain, a moment where you could do something different. Most of this is reversible. The brain is plastic. The hippocampus, that poor, battered, long-suffering hippocampus, can actually grow back. Exercise helps. Sleep helps. Deep reading helps. Boredom, it turns out, helps enormously. That's the good news. The bad news is that the version of you that needs to reverse all of this is the same version that's been making all these decisions. The brain is the only organ that has to fix itself using itself. And the fact that it can do that at all is, I think, the most hopeful part of everything I've said. So maybe start small. Put the phone in another room tonight. See what happens, see what you remember, see what comes back. And hey, if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. Also, let me know your thoughts on what I just shared. Oh, and there's more. I've just started a Patreon to help support these videos and connect with you more directly. Check out the link in the description if you'd like to join.